The water rushed through Margaret Chen's living room like a dark prophecy fulfilled, swallowing her Persian rugs and family photos as the HOA president's voice echoed in her memory, "You're being hysterical about a little drainage issue." Now, as she stood knee-deep in the flood that had destroyed 47 homes, Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed her attorney. The same neighbors who had laughed at her warnings, Margaret Chen had been called worse things than the neighborhood busybody, but as she stood in the Willowbrook Commons HOA meeting on that sweltering Tuesday evening in July, watching President Richard Blackwood's smug face dismiss her concerns with a wave of his manicured hand, she felt the familiar burn of righteous fury in her chest. "Mrs. Chen, with all due respect," Blackwood's voice dripped with condescension as he adjusted his silk tie, "you've been beating this dead horse for 6 months. The drainage system is fine. Our contractors assured us your contractors are idiots," Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting through the humid air of the community center like a blade. The room fell silent except for the wheeze of the ancient air conditioning unit. 23 faces turned toward her, most wearing expressions that ranged from mild annoyance to outright hostility. She stood up, her 5'4" frame somehow commanding attention as she clutched the manila folder that had become her obsession. "I've been a civil engineer for 32 years. I've seen what happens when you ignore hydrology reports and cut corners on storm water management. That new development they are building upstream is going to funnel water directly into our neighborhood during heavy rains." Board member Sandra Morrison rolled her eyes dramatically. "Here we go again with the doom and gloom predictions." "The doom and gloom predictions," Margaret shot back, "are called professional assessments based on topographical data and rainfall patterns. But I forgot your expertise comes from selling real estate, not understanding how water flows." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the room. Margaret's husband, David, tugged gently at her sleeve from the chair beside her. "Honey, maybe we should." "No." Margaret shook him off, her dark eyes blazing. "I'm not backing down this time. Every single one of you is going to regret ignoring this." Blackwood's face reddened. At 58, he was used to being the alpha in any room, his success in commercial real estate having afforded him the sprawling corner lot house that dominated their upscale neighborhood. His wife, Priscilla, sat in the front row wearing enough diamonds to fund a small country, nodding along with his every word like a bobblehead. "Mrs. Chen," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Margaret's teeth clench, "I understand you think you know better than the professionals we hired, but I don't think I know better." I know better." Margaret opened her folder and pulled out a stack of documents. "These are the original drainage plans for Willowbrook Commons, filed in 1987. These are the modifications made in 2019 when Pinnacle Development bought the land upstream. And these," she held up a thick report, "are the flood projections I had an independent hydrologist run based on the new development's impact on our watershed." She walked to the front of the room, her heels clicking against the worn linoleum. "The storm drains you're so confident about. They were designed for a 10-year flood event. The new development upstream, with all its impervious surfaces and rerouted drainage, means we are now looking at a 50-year flood event hitting us with the force of a 100-year flood." "That's a lot of numbers and scary predictions," Morrison said with a laugh that sounded forced. "But you're talking about theoretical situations that probably won't happen in our lifetimes." "Theoretical?" Margaret's voice rose an octave. "Sandra, do you remember Hurricane Agnes in 1972? No, of course you don't, you moved here from Arizona 5 years ago." "But I do. I was 12 years old and I watched water destroy half the town. Because people said the same thing you're saying now, it won't happen here." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. They'd been married for 28 years and he'd learned to recognize the signs. Margaret was past the point of diplomacy, and well into the zone where she would burn bridges to make her point. He'd seen her do it at work, fighting with contractors and city planners who thought they could cut corners on public safety. She'd been right every time, but being right didn't always make you popular. "The point is," Blackwood said, clearly, "wanting to regain control of the meeting, we've invested significant resources in our current infrastructure. The board has reviewed the situation and determined that no further action is necessary." "The board has reviewed nothing." Margaret slammed her folder down on the table, causing several people to jump. "You've looked at cost estimates and decided." That your property values matter more than flood safety. Well, let me tell you something about property values, Richard. They tend to plummet when houses are sitting under 6 feet of water. That's enough, Blackwood snapped. You're being hysterical about a minor drainage issue. The word hysterical hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Margaret felt the familiar surge of anger that came with being dismissed because she was a woman. Because she was emotional, because she cared too much about things that inconvenienced other people's comfortable lives. Hysterical, she repeated slowly, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. You know what's hysterical, Richard? Your belief that you can ignore physics because it's inconvenient. She turned to address the room, her voice gaining strength with each word. In 3 weeks, we're going to get hit with the first major storm system of the season. The meteorologists are already predicting above-average rainfall for August. And when that water comes rushing down from the hills, carrying all the runoff from those brand new parking lots and buildings upstream, it's going to find the path of least resistance. Margaret pointed toward the windows that looked out onto the manicured lawns and expensive houses of their neighborhood. That path of least resistance runs right through our streets, into our storm drains that are already inadequate, and then into our homes. And while you're all standing in your flooded living rooms, watching your furniture float away, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that you had a chance to prevent it, and you chose not to because it was easier to call me crazy. Nobody's calling you crazy, Morrison said, though her tone suggested otherwise. You're right, Margaret replied. You're calling me hysterical. Because apparently, in your world, showing emotion about potential catastrophe is worse than ignoring evidence of actual danger. She gathered her papers and stuffed them back into the folder. I'm done wasting my time trying to save people who don't want to be saved. But I want this meeting recorded in the minutes, and I want my warnings documented, because when the lawsuits start flying, I want everyone to remember that I tried to prevent this. Lawsuits. Blackwood's voice cracked slightly on the word. Oh, Richard, Margaret said, her voice now carrying a note of dark satisfaction. You have no idea what's coming. The water is just the beginning. As she turned to leave, her husband scrambling to follow, she heard Morrison's voice behind her. Some people just love being the center of attention. Margaret paused at the door, her hand on the handle. For a moment, David thought she might turn around and unleash another verbal assault. Instead, she spoke without looking back, her voice calm and certain. In exactly 18 days, Hurricane Delilah is going to make landfall 200 miles south of here. It's going to stall over the mountains and dump 14 inches of rain. In 36 hours. The water is going to come down those hills like a freight train, and it's going to destroy everything in its path. She opened the door, letting in a blast of humid summer air that carried the scent of approaching rain. And when it's over, when you're standing in the wreckage of your perfect little neighborhood, you're going to realize that the crazy lady with the engineering degree was the only one who saw it coming. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving the room in stunned silence. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like a gentle warning of the fury to come. Blackwood stared at the door for a long moment, then cleared his throat. Well, that was a dramatic. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, the annual block party planning committee. But as the meeting continued, several residents found themselves glancing nervously at the windows where the rain was beginning to fall with increasing intensity. And somewhere in the back of their minds, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, they should have listened to Margaret Chen. 3 blocks away, Margaret sat in her car in the parking lot of the community center, watching the rain streak down her windshield. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter in Seattle. How did the meeting go, Mom? Margaret typed back, about as well as expected. They'll learn soon enough. She started the engine and pulled out onto the street, her headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. As she drove home through the quiet streets of Willowbrook Commons, she made a mental note to call her insurance agent in the morning. 14 days after the HOA meeting, Margaret Chen stood in her kitchen at 5:47 a.m., watching the Weather Channel on her tablet while her coffee brewed. The meteorologist's voice carried the practiced urgency of someone who'd delivered countless storm warnings, but Margaret caught the subtle change in his tone, the barely perceptible shift from routine caution to genuine concern. Hurricane Delilah has intensified to a Category 2 storm and is expected to make landfall along the Carolina coast sometime Sunday evening. However, the real concern isn't the wind speed, it's the storm's unusual track and the potential for catastrophic flooding as it moves inland and stalls over the Appalachian foothills. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from her neighbor 3 houses down saw the weather report. "You still think we are all going to die?" Faced with tears of joy, she set the phone aside without responding and pulled up the National Hurricane Center's latest track prediction. The storm was following exactly the path she'd predicted, and the rainfall projections made her stomach clench. 14 to 16 inches over 36 hours, with the heaviest concentrations falling directly over their watershed. "Jesus," she whispered, then immediately felt guilty for the blasphemy. David always said she swore more when she was scared. By 7 a.m., she was dressed and heading to the hardware store, passing the construction site of the new Pinnacle development on her way. The massive project sprawled across 47 acres that had been pristine woodland just 2 years ago. Now, it was a maze of concrete foundations, storm drains, and freshly paved roads, all designed to funnel water away from the new houses and directly into the existing drainage system that fed into Willowbrook Commons. She pulled into the parking lot and sat for a moment, staring at the half-finished buildings. The irony wasn't lost on her that most of the people who would be living here within the next 6 months probably had no idea their dream homes were built on what was essentially a floodplain. At the hardware store, she grabbed extra batteries, a weather radio, and 5 more tarps to add to her growing collection. The clerk, a teenager with multiple piercings and a bored expression, looked at her purchases with curiosity. "Storm prep?" he asked. "Something like that." Margaret paid in cash and headed home, where she spent the next 3 hours moving everything valuable from her basement to the second floor. David found her in the basement at noon, wrestling with a 50-pound toolbox. "Honey, what are you doing?" He looked tired. He'd been working extra shifts at the hospital, trying to make up for the vacation they'd cancelled when Margaret had insisted they needed to be home for the hurricane. "Moving everything that matters," she grunted as she lifted the toolbox onto a hand truck. "The basement is going to flood. Probably the first floor too." David rubbed his forehead, the gesture he always made when he was trying to be patient with her. "The weather service is saying we'll get some rain, but nothing catastrophic." "Maybe you're being a little what?" Margaret's voice carried a warning edge. "A little hysterical. A little dramatic. A little crazy. I was going to say cautious. But okay, you've made your point." David sighed. "I'll help you move the tools." That afternoon, Margaret drove through the neighborhood, noting which houses had any storm preparations. The Blackwoods mansion showed no signs of concern. Their perfectly manicured lawn was still dotted with expensive outdoor furniture, and their 3-car garage doors were open, revealing Richard's collection of vintage cars parked at ground level. She pulled into the parking lot of the community center and sat in her car, watching the sky. The clouds were moving in an unusual pattern, swirling in slow, ominous circles that reminded her of water going down a drain. She'd seen clouds like this before, in 1985, 2 hours before Hurricane Gloria had turned her hometown into a war zone. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed her daughter's name. "Mom, I saw the weather reports. Are you and Dad okay?" "We are fine, sweetheart. Just getting ready for some rain." "Some rain?" "Mom, they are talking about a major hurricane." "Maybe. You should come up here until it passes." Margaret looked out at the peaceful neighborhood, where people were going about their Friday afternoon routines with no apparent concern for the catastrophe bearing down on them. "I can't leave, honey. Someone needs to witness what's about to happen." "Witness what?" "The consequence of arrogance." Saturday morning brought an eerie stillness that made Margaret's skin crawl. The air was thick and oppressive, with that peculiar yellow tint that preceded violent weather. She'd been up since 4 a.m., monitoring weather reports and making final preparations. At 8:30, her doorbell rang. She opened it to find Sandra Morrison standing on her porch, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Margaret, I wanted to ask you something." Sandra's usual confidence was nowhere to be seen. I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but you really think this storm is going to be bad? Margaret studied her neighbor's face, noting the worry lines around her eyes and the way she kept glancing at the sky. Sandra, are you asking me as someone who mocked my warnings for 6 months, or as someone who's genuinely concerned about what's coming? Look, maybe I was wrong to dismiss you. My sister lives in New Orleans and she said the way you described the water patterns reminded her of what happened before Katrina. I have my grandchildren visiting this weekend, and if there's really a chance. Margaret felt the familiar war between her desire to say, I told you so, and her genuine concern for innocent people, especially children. Her better angels won. Sandra, if you have children in your house, you need to get them to higher ground. Tonight. The water is going to come fast and it's going to be deep. But where can we go? The hotels are all booked because of the storm. My daughter's old room is empty. You can bring the kids here if you want. We are on the highest elevation in the neighborhood, and I've got the house prepped for flooding. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. Why would you help me after the way I've treated you? Because being right doesn't make me heartless. Margaret looked past Sandra toward the street, where she could see other neighbors beginning to move patio furniture and potted plants. But Sandra, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to remember that when your neighbors were calling me crazy, I was the one who offered to help. I will. I promise. By evening, Margaret's house had become an unofficial refugee center. Sandra had arrived with her 2 grandchildren, ages 7 and 10. The Hendersons from the end of the street had brought their elderly mother, who couldn't evacuate because of her oxygen tanks. Even the Amadas, who had been among the most vocal critics of Margaret's warnings, had sheepishly asked if they could park their car in her driveway, the highest point on the block. At 11 p.m., Margaret stood in her living room, looking out at the neighborhood that had dismissed her warnings. The wind was picking up, and the first bands of rain were beginning to lash the windows. Her weather radio crackled with increasingly urgent updates. Hurricane Delilah has made landfall and is moving inland faster than expected. Catastrophic flooding is expected across the region as the storm stalls over the mountains. Residents in flood-prone areas should seek higher ground immediately. David appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Think they are listening now. Margaret took the coffee and sipped it, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. Some of them are. But it's too late for most of them. As if summoned by her words, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Richard Blackwood's number. Margaret, I need to ask you something. His voice was tight with barely controlled panic. The water in our street, it's already up to the curbs. And the storm hasn't even hit yet. How is that possible? Margaret walked to the window and looked down at the street. Sure enough, water was beginning to pool in the low spots, creating dark mirrors that reflected the street lights. Richard, that's not rainwater. That's groundwater. The water table is saturated from the rain we've been getting all week, and now it has nowhere to go. When the real rain starts, it's going to be like trying to pour water into a full bathtub. But our house, it's never flooded before. We are not in a flood zone. You're not in a designated flood zone because the maps are based on historical data that doesn't account for the new development upstream. Richard, how much of your house is below street level? The finished basement and the first floor is only about 2 feet above the street. Margaret closed her eyes. The Blackwoods' house was beautiful, but it was built in the 1960s when builders didn't think about flood elevation. Most of the first floor was barely above grade level. Richard, you need to get out of there. Now. Take your family and go to a hotel inland or find someone on higher ground. But all our things, your things are replaceable. Your family isn't. There was a long pause. Margaret, I owe you an apology. I should have listened to you. Save the apology for later. Right now, just get your family to safety. After she hung up, Margaret stood at the window watching the water levels rise. The storm was still hours away from its peak, but already the neighborhood was beginning to transform. Street lights reflected off growing pools of water, and she could see the first signs of panic as residents realized their cars were trapped by rising water. At 2 a.m., Hurricane Delilah arrived with a fury that exceeded even Margaret's worst P. Dawn broke over Willowbrook Commons like a war zone revelation. Margaret stood on her second-floor balcony, surveying the devastation that stretched as far as she could see. Where manicured lawns and tree-lined streets had existed 12 hours earlier, now lay a lake of murky brown water dotted with debris, cars, furniture, pieces of houses, and things she didn't want to identify. The water had reached a depth of nearly 6 feet at its peak around 4 a.m., turning their suburban paradise into a violent river that had swept away everything in its path. Now, as the storm finally moved inland, the water level was slowly dropping, revealing the true scope of the disaster. "My God," Sandra Morrison whispered from beside her. She'd been standing there for 20 minutes, staring at where her house should have been. The two-story colonial was still there, but everything below the second-floor windows was underwater, and the current had torn away the front porch and most of the attached garage. Margaret's phone had been buzzing constantly since sunrise, text messages from neighbors, emergency services, and news outlets. The one that haunted her most was from Richard Blackwood, sent at 5:23 a.m., water receding. "Priscilla hurt. Please. Help." She tried calling back, but the call went straight to voicemail. Most of the cell towers in the area were down, and even her landline was dead. "We need to get down there," David said, appearing behind them with a cup of coffee and a grim expression. "I can see people moving around in some of the houses. They are going to need medical attention." Margaret nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead to the bigger picture. The immediate crisis was far from over, but she was already thinking about what came next. The insurance claims, the investigations, the questions about who knew what and when. And the lawsuits. God, the lawsuits that were coming. By 10 a.m., the water had dropped enough for them to wade through the streets. Margaret had put on her highest boots and grabbed her emergency medical kit, following David as he made his way from house to house, checking on survivors. The Hendersons' house was a total loss, the entire first floor was gutted, and Mrs. Henderson's oxygen concentrator was somewhere at the bottom of the lake that had been their living room. The Amadas had lost 3 cars and their entire first floor, but they were alive and had managed to save their cat. It was at the Blackwoods mansion that they found the real tragedy. The house was a monument to excess even in its damaged state, a 6,000-square-foot McMansion that had been Richard's pride and joy. Now the first floor was destroyed, and water stains on the exterior walls showed that the flood had reached nearly 8 feet at its peak. Margaret waded through the front yard, which was littered with debris from half the neighborhood. Richard's vintage car collection was gone. She could see the top of a red Corvette poking up from the water near the storm drain where the current had deposited it. "Richard!" David called out. "Are you okay?" A window opened on the second floor, and Richard's head appeared. His face was haggard, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his eyes held a look of shell-shocked desperation. "David, thank God." Priscilla fell down the stairs when the water started coming in. "I think her arm is broken, and she's been unconscious on and off all night." Margaret felt her professional instincts kick in. "We need to get her to a hospital. Can you get her downstairs? The stairs are underwater. The whole first floor is gone." Richard's voice cracked. "Everything is gone." David was already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling for a rescue boat. We'll get her out of there." As they waited for emergency services, Margaret found herself staring at the destruction around them. 47 houses in Willowbrook Commons, and every single one had been damaged. Some, like the houses in the lower elevations, were complete losses. Others had suffered significant damage to their first floors, basements, and foundations. The financial impact was staggering. She did quick mental calculations. Average home value in their neighborhood was around $400,000. Even if insurance covered half the damages, they were looking at close to $10 million in losses. But insurance wouldn't cover half the damages. Most homeowners' policies excluded flood damage, and the majority of her neighbors had never purchased flood insurance because they weren't in a designated flood zone. They were about to lose everything. "Margaret!" Richard's voice came from the window above. "I need to tell you something." She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. What is it? I got a call yesterday from someone at Pinnacle Development. They wanted to know if we'd received any complaints about drainage or flooding concerns. Margaret's blood turned to ice. What did you tell them? I told them no. I told them our neighborhood had never had any flooding issues. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. I didn't mention your warnings. I thought you were wrong. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. Pinnacle Development was already preparing their defense, gathering evidence to show that they couldn't have known their project would cause flooding because no one had complained. And Richard had just handed them the perfect cover story. You stupid, arrogant bastard, she breathed. I'm sorry. I was trying to protect our property values. I thought if word got out that we were worried about flooding, you thought wrong. Margaret's voice carried across the water, causing several neighbors to turn and look. You just gave them everything they need to avoid liability. Do you understand what you've done? The rescue boat arrived 20 minutes later, and Margaret watched as EMTs carefully extracted Priscilla Blackwood from the second-floor window. The woman was conscious but clearly in pain, her left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. As the boat pulled away, Richard looked back at Margaret with desperate eyes. What do we do now? Margaret didn't answer. She was already thinking about the legal implications, the insurance battles, the years of litigation that lay ahead. But most of all, she was thinking about the phone call she needed to make. That evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen with her laptop, drafting an email to her attorney. The house was quiet. Most of the neighbors who had taken shelter with her had gone to hotels or relatives' houses, leaving her and David alone with the magnitude of what had happened. She'd spent the afternoon documenting everything, taking photos of the flood damage, making notes about water levels and timing, and most importantly, gathering evidence of her warnings to the HOA. The email she'd sent to Richard in March, warning about the drainage issues. The certified letter she'd sent to the HOA board in April, outlining her concerns about the new development. The engineering report she'd commissioned in May, showing the increased flood risk. All of it carefully preserved and documented. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed her daughter's number. Mom, I saw the news. Are you and Dad okay? We're fine, sweetheart. Our house is mostly okay. We are on high ground. I saw the aerial footage. It looks like a war zone. Margaret looked out her kitchen window at the neighborhood that was slowly emerging from the floodwaters. It is a war zone. And the war is just beginning. What do you mean? I mean that 47 families just lost everything because their HOA board was too arrogant to listen to warnings about a preventable disaster. And the company that caused this disaster is already trying to cover their tracks. Mom, what are you going to do? Margaret opened her laptop and pulled up the contact information for the law firm that had handled her professional liability insurance case 5 years earlier. I'm going to do what I should have done 6 months ago. I'm going to make sure everyone responsible for this disaster pays for what they've done. Are you talking about a lawsuit? I'm talking about justice. The next morning, Margaret received a call from Janet Morrison, Sandra's sister-in-law who lived in the next neighborhood over. Janet was a paralegal at one of the largest personal injury firms in the state, and she'd heard about the flooding through Sandra. Margaret, I want you to know that our firm is very interested in what happened in your neighborhood. We've been tracking the Pinnacle Development project for months, and we think there might be grounds for a class action lawsuit. What kind of grounds? Negligence, environmental damage, failure to conduct proper impact studies. The kind of case that could result in significant compensation for the victims. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. How significant? Potentially tens of millions of dollars. These developers have deep pockets and they cut corners on the drainage system to save money. If we can prove they knew their project would cause flooding and they did it anyway. They knew, Margaret said quietly. And I can prove it. That afternoon, Margaret walked through her neighborhood with a camera and a notebook, documenting the destruction and interviewing neighbors. What she found was a community in shock, with people who had lost everything and nowhere to turn. The Amadas had lost their small business. Their home office where they ran an import company was completely destroyed, along with all their inventory and records. The Hendersons faced the impossible choice of rebuilding or walking away from the house they'd lived in for 30 years. Sandra Morrison was crying over the loss of family heirlooms that had been in her basement. And through it all, Margaret kept thinking about Richard Blackwood's phone call to Pinnacle Development. The call that had potentially destroyed any chance of holding the developer. 6 weeks after Hurricane Delilah, Margaret Chen sat in the conference room of Hartwell, Morrison and Associates, surrounded by boxes of evidence and 43 of her neighbors. The mahogany table was covered with engineering reports, weather data, insurance documents, and photographs of the devastation that had once been Willowbrook Commons. Lead attorney James Hartwell, a silver-haired man with the demeanor of someone who had built his career on David versus Goliath cases, leaned forward and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, what happened to your neighborhood wasn't an act of God. It was the predictable result of corporate negligence and administrative incompetence. And we are going to prove it." Margaret watched the faces around the table, some hopeful, others skeptical, all of them marked by the trauma of losing everything they'd worked for. Sandra Morrison sat across from her, still wearing the haunted expression that had become permanent since the flood. The Amadas were there, along with the Hendersons, the Patels, and dozens of other neighbors whose lives had been turned upside down by 6 feet of water. Notably absent was Richard Blackwood. "Our case is built on 3 pillars," Hartwell continued. First, Pinnacle Development knew their project would cause flooding and proceeded anyway. Second, they failed to conduct proper environmental impact studies. And third, they deliberately concealed information about the flood risk from local authorities and residents. He gestured to Margaret. "Mrs. Chen's warnings and documentation provide the foundation for our case. She not only predicted exactly what would happen, but she created an extensive paper trail showing that the relevant parties were warned repeatedly about the danger." Margaret stood and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. She'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, and her presentation was methodical and devastating. "In January of last year, I obtained the preliminary drainage plans for the Pinnacle Development project. The plans showed a 40% increase in impervious surfaces upstream from our neighborhood, with storm water runoff being redirected into our existing drainage system." She pointed to a diagram on the board. "Our system was designed in 1987 for a 10-year flood event. The new development would channel water equivalent to a 50-year flood event into those same drains." She turned to face the room. "I brought these concerns to the HOA board in March, April, and May. I provided engineering reports, rainfall projections, and specific recommendations for mitigation measures. The board not only ignored my warnings, they actively ridiculed them." Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. "Margaret, I need to ask you something that's been bothering me. You knew this was going to happen. You prepared your house, you moved your valuables, you even offered to help some of us. Why didn't you do more to force the issue?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret had been dreading it, because she'd been asking herself the same thing every night since the flood. "Because I tried everything I could think of within the system," she said quietly. "I sent certified letters to the HOA board, to the city planning department, to the county engineers. I filed formal complaints with the state environmental agency. I even contacted a lawyer about filing an injunction to stop the development." What did the lawyer say? That I didn't have standing to sue unless I could prove imminent harm. And that even if I could prove harm, the legal process would take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Margaret's voice carried the weight of months of frustration. "I was one person trying to stop a multi-million-dollar development with the backing of city officials who had already approved the project." Sandra Morrison spoke up. "What about going to the media? Or organizing the neighborhood?" "I tried that too. I contacted 3 local news stations about the flood risk. 2 of them never responded, and the third one said they'd look into it but never followed up. As for organizing the neighborhood..." Margaret looked around the room at faces that were now sympathetic but had been hostile just weeks earlier. How many of you would have listened to me 6 months ago if I'd shown up at your door talking about flood risks and asking you to join a lawsuit against a development that hadn't even been built yet? The silence was her answer. Hartwell cleared his throat. The important thing is that Mrs. Chen's warnings are extensively documented. We have copies of her letters to the HOA, her engineering reports, her communications with city officials, and her predictions about the specific flood patterns that ultimately occurred. He pulled out a thick folder. We also have evidence that Pinnacle Development was aware of the flood risk and chose to proceed anyway. Internal emails obtained through discovery showed that their engineers raised concerns about downstream flooding as early as 18 months ago. Margaret felt a surge of vindication. What did the emails say? Quote, the drainage modifications will significantly increase runoff into the existing Willowbrook Commons storm system. Recommend additional retention basins or alternative discharge routes to prevent downstream flooding. End quote. And what was Pinnacle's response? Quote, retention basins will reduce developable acreage by 12% and increase costs by $2.3 million. Proceed with original drainage plan. Legal liability is minimal given existing zoning approvals. End quote. A murmur of anger rippled through the room. Sandra Morrison slammed her hand on the table. Those bastards knew exactly what they were doing. Yes, they did, Hartwell said grimly. But here's where our case gets complicated. We've also discovered that someone from your HOA board contacted Pinnacle Development during the project planning phase to discuss potential drainage concerns. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Who? Richard Blackwood. He had 3 documented conversations with Pinnacle's project manager between February and April of last year. In those conversations, he assured them that the neighborhood had no flooding concerns and that no residents had raised any objections to the project. The room erupted in angry voices. Margaret sat down heavily, feeling the weight of betrayal and frustration crushing down on her. He lied, she said quietly. He knew I had raised concerns because I presented them to the board. He knew about my engineering reports because I gave copies to every board member. We know, Hartwell said. We have the meeting minutes from those HOA meetings and we have copies of the materials you provided. But Blackwood's statements to Pinnacle give them a potential defense. They can claim they relied on assurances from local officials that there were no flooding concerns. Margaret stood up abruptly. Where is Richard now? He's retained his own attorney. He's claiming that he was acting in the best interests of the neighborhood by trying to prevent negative publicity that might affect property values. His what? Sandra Morrison's voice was shrill with disbelief. He's trying to defend himself by saying he was protecting us. It gets worse, Hartwell continued. Blackwood's attorney is arguing that he should be considered a co-victim rather than a co-defendant. They are claiming that he was misled by Pinnacle's assurances about drainage safety and that he has the right to join our lawsuit as a plaintiff. Margaret felt a rage so pure and intense that it made her vision blur. That son of a bitch is trying to profit from his own negligence. What's our legal position? Asked Mr. Yamada. Can he really join our lawsuit? Technically, yes. He suffered the same damages as the rest of you, and he wasn't personally involved in the development project. But what? Margaret demanded. We are going to file a separate lawsuit against the HOA board for negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. And Richard Blackwood is going to be our primary defendant. The room fell silent. Margaret looked around at her neighbors, seeing the same mixture of satisfaction and apprehension on their faces that she felt in her own heart. What kind of damages are we talking about? Asked Mrs. Henderson. Against Pinnacle Development, we are seeking $47 million in compensatory damages, plus punitive damages that could reach $100 million. Against the HOA board, we are seeking $12 million in compensatory damages and $25 million in punitive damages. Margaret did the math quickly. That's nearly $4 million per household if we win everything. If we win, Hartwell emphasized. These cases are never guaranteed. Pinnacle has deep pockets and excellent lawyers. They are going to fight this with everything they have. What's their likely defense strategy? Sandra asked. They are going to argue that the flooding was caused by an unprecedented weather event that no one could have predicted. They'll claim that Hurricane Delilah was a once-in-a-century storm that exceeded all reasonable planning parameters. Margaret laughed bitterly. Except that I predicted it exactly. I told them down to the inch how much water would accumulate and where it would go. Which is why your testimony is crucial, Hartwell said. But they are also going to attack your credibility. They'll argue that you're a disgruntled neighbor with a personal vendetta against the development. They'll claim that your warnings were based on speculation rather than scientific analysis. I have an engineering degree from MIT and 32 years of experience in hydrology. My warnings were based on topographical analysis, rainfall data, and drainage calculations. And we'll present all of that evidence. But you need to understand that this is going to be a long, expensive, and emotionally draining fight. The defense attorneys are G. 18 months after Hurricane Delilah, Margaret Chen stood in the witness box of the Superior Court of Pennsylvania, her right hand raised as she swore to tell the truth. The courtroom was packed, 43 plaintiffs, dozens of attorneys, members of the media, and in the back row, Richard Blackwood, looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. The Pinnacle development trial had concluded 3 months earlier with a $73 million verdict in favor of the Willowbrook Commons residents. Pinnacle's appeals were still pending, but their insurance company had already begun settlement negotiations. Today was the culmination of the HOA negligence case, the personal reckoning that Margaret had been waiting for since that humid Tuesday evening when Richard Blackwood had called her hysterical. James Hartwell approached the witness stand with the confidence of a man who had spent months preparing for this moment. Mrs. Chen, please tell the court about your professional background. Margaret's voice was calm and clear as she recited her credentials: MIT engineering degree, 32 years in civil engineering and hydrology, expert witness in 14 previous flooding cases. She watched the jury absorb this information, seeing their expressions shift from polite attention to genuine interest. In March of last year, did you become aware of potential flooding risks to your neighborhood? Yes. I obtained copies of the preliminary drainage plans for the Pinnacle development project and conducted an analysis of the potential impact on our existing storm water management system. What did your analysis reveal? Margaret turned slightly to address the jury directly. The new development would increase impervious surface area upstream by 40%, meaning 40% more rainwater would flow into our drainage system instead of being absorbed by the ground. Our existing storm drains were designed in 1987 for a 10-year flood event, roughly 4 inches of rain in 24 hours. The new development would channel water equivalent to a 50-year flood event into those same drains. Did you share these concerns with anyone? I brought my analysis to the HOA board meeting on March 15th. I provided copies of my engineering report to all 5 board members, including detailed flood projections and specific recommendations for mitigation measures. Hartwell walked to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence Plaintiff's Exhibit 47, the engineering report provided by Mrs. Chen to the HOA board. Margaret watched as the bailiff handed copies to the jury. She had spent weeks polishing that report, knowing that someday it might be the difference between justice and injustice. Mrs. Chen, how did the board respond to your warnings? Margaret's jaw tightened as she remembered that night. They dismissed my concerns. Board President Richard Blackwood stated that I was being hysterical about a minor drainage issue and suggested that I was creating problems where none existed. Did you make any further attempts to warn the board? I attended the April and May board meetings, providing updated weather projections and additional engineering analysis. At the May meeting, I specifically warned that hurricane season could bring catastrophic flooding to our neighborhood. How did Mr. Blackwood respond to these warnings? Margaret looked directly at Richard Blackwood in the back of the courtroom. His face was pale, and he was avoiding her gaze. He said, and I quote, Mrs. Chen, you've been beating this dead horse for 6 months. The drainage system is fine. Our contractors assured us. When I insisted that his contractors were wrong, he said I was being dramatic and that some people just love being the center of attention. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Margaret saw several jurors exchange Glances. Mrs. Chen, we've heard testimony that Mr. Blackwood contacted Pinnacle Development during the planning phase of their project. Were you aware of these communications? Not at the time. I discovered them during the discovery phase of this lawsuit. What did you learn about those communications? Margaret felt the familiar surge of anger, but her voice remained steady. I learned that in 3 separate phone conversations, Mr. Blackwood assured Pinnacle's project manager that our neighborhood had no flooding concerns and that no residents had raised any objections to the project. But you had raised objections, hadn't you? I had provided the board with detailed engineering reports documenting serious flood risks. Mr. Blackwood knew about my concerns because I had presented them to him personally at 3 separate board meetings. So when he told Pinnacle Development that no residents had raised flooding concerns, was that statement accurate? It was a deliberate lie. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Patricia Hoffman gavelled for silence. Mrs. Chen, in your professional opinion, could the flooding that occurred on August 14th have been prevented? Margaret had been waiting for this question. Yes. If Pinnacle Development had implemented the retention basins and alternative drainage routes recommended by their own engineers, the flood would not have occurred. If our HOA board had insisted on proper flood mitigation measures as a condition of supporting the development, the flood would not have occurred. If Mr. Blackwood had honestly represented our concerns to Pinnacle instead of lying about them, the flood would not have occurred. How certain are you of these conclusions? I am certain beyond any doubt. The flooding was entirely preventable. It happened because people prioritized short-term financial interests over public safety. Hartwell nodded. Your witness? Margaret watched as Richard Blackwood's attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Catherine Morse, approached the witness stand. Morse had a reputation for aggressive cross-examination, and Margaret had spent hours preparing for this moment. Mrs. Chen, isn't it true that you have a history of conflict with homeowners associations? Margaret raised an eyebrow. I have a history of holding people accountable when they ignore safety concerns. You sued your previous HOA in 2018, didn't you? I filed a complaint when they refused to repair a retaining wall that was in danger of collapse. The wall failed 6 months later and destroyed 2 cars. And you sued a municipal planning board. In 2015, I filed an objection when they approved a subdivision in a wetland area without proper environmental review. The development was later cancelled when the EPA found multiple violations. Morse's strategy was becoming clear: paint Margaret as a serial litigant who created problems for financial gain. Margaret had expected this approach. Isn't it true, Mrs. Chen, that you stand to profit significantly from these lawsuits? I stand to be compensated for my losses, like every other victim of this preventable disaster. But you've positioned yourself as the lead plaintiff in multiple cases, haven't you? Cases that could result in millions of dollars in attorney's fees. Margaret felt her temper rising but kept her voice level. Ms. Morse, I positioned myself as someone who tried to prevent a catastrophe and was ignored. The attorney's fees are irrelevant to me. I want justice for my neighbors who lost everything because your client lied to the people who could have prevented this disaster. You call it lying, but isn't it possible that Mr. Blackwood genuinely believed the development posed no threat? No. It's not possible. Margaret's voice carried the weight of 18 months of accumulated fury. Mr. Blackwood sat through 3 board meetings where I presented detailed engineering analysis proving that the development would cause flooding. He received copies of my reports showing exactly where the water would go and how deep it would be. He knew that 47 families were at risk, and he chose to lie about it to protect property values. But you're not a mind reader, are you, Mrs. Chen? You can't know what Mr. Blackwood was thinking. Margaret smiled grimly. I don't need to read his mind, Ms. Morse. I have his words. She gestured to Hartwell, who handed her a document. On July 28, 2 weeks before the hurricane, Mr. Blackwood sent an email to the other board members discussing my warnings. Quote, Chen is still stirring up trouble about flooding. We need to keep this quiet until after the Pinnacle project is completed. If word gets out about potential flood risks, it could affect our property values and derail the development. End quote. The courtroom fell silent. Margaret watched the blood drain from Richard Blackwood's face. "He knew I was right," she continued. "He knew the flood was coming. And he chose to hide that information because he cared more about money than about people's lives." Morse tried to recover. "Mrs. Chen, even if Mr. Blackwood made errors in judgment, isn't it true that the ultimate responsibility lies with Pinnacle Development?" "Pinnacle Development bears primary responsibility, yes. But Richard Blackwood could have stopped this disaster with a single phone call. Instead, he chose to enable it." Margaret's voice grew quiet and deadly. "Ms. Morse, your client had a fiduciary duty to protect the residents of our neighborhood. Instead, he actively worked to conceal dangers that he knew could kill us." "That's quite an accusation." "It's not an accusation. It's a fact." Margaret turned to look directly at the jury. "On August 14, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson died of a heart attack while trying to evacuate her flooded home. She was 83 years old, and she died because Richard Blackwood prioritized his property values over her life." The courtroom was utterly silent. Margaret could see tears in the eyes of several jurors. The Kovac family's 6-year-old dog,